I'd like to now introduce our other Partis Humanitarian Prize winner, Dr. Robert Van Voren, who has dedicated his life to the cause of human rights and mental health. For 45 years, his dynamic leadership and global efforts in the field have provided direction as well as practical support for making human rights a strong pillar of how societies deal with persons living with mental illness. His work includes creating countless initiatives and activities for schools, workshops, training seminars, advocacy campaigns, establishing and restructuring mental health services, documenting human rights abuses, and giving voice to people with mental illness. Today, he'll discuss his efforts to provide psychological support to the victims of state repression in Belarus and the victims of war in Ukraine. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Van Voren.
Thank you. Thank you. I do not believe in coincidences. Today it's not my birthday, but it's the birthday of my wife, who is sitting down there. So now I understand. So now I understand why we were selected to share the prize together. Ladies and gentlemen, while we are gathering here, more than 13 million Ukrainian citizens, more than 13 million Ukrainian citizens have been evicted from their homes, have been forced to move westward, away from the front line, or have sought refuge in other countries in order to save themselves and their offspring from the horrors of war. One does not have to be a mental health professional to understand what the psychological consequences are and will be for generations to come. We do not know exactly how many civilians have been killed. The southern city of Mariupol used to have a population of about 300,000 citizens. The estimates are that 1/3 of the population was killed during the relentless bombing that erased the city from the face of the earth. In the whole of the country, probably hundreds of thousands of civilians have been killed, either as a result of the bombings or because of the terror that was unleashed on them in occupied territories. Here, people were tortured, raped, and killed by the invading forces, and every day new mass graves are being uncovered. And also in this case, we do not have exact numbers, but the number of victims must be in the thousands, and we also know that the number of Ukrainian soldiers who died in battle is considerable. All of them have left families behind, parents, wives, girlfriends, children, all victimized by a war they never asked for and didn't cause themselves. This total absurdity of a war that is focused on the extermination of Ukraine as an independent nation and that has clear genocidal tendencies causes severe psychological distress. In the second part of my talk, I will focus on what the organization I lead, the Federation Global Initiative on Psychiatry, is doing to counter those consequences. In the first part, I want to focus more on my personal story and my involvement. I've been working in Ukraine for more than 32 years and have seen a nation grown into what it is right now. When it became independent in 1991, very few people in Ukraine really believed in the country, and for a long time the idea that Ukraine was a country worth dying for was far from being widespread. This all changed in 2013, 2014, when a national uprising led to the ousting of a pro-Moscow president, which was followed by the beginning of the war that is continuing until this very day. Just to be exact, the war didn't start this year on February 24. It started in 2014 when Russia illegally annexed Crimea and organized the takeover of two regions in the east. And then from that moment onwards, there was war, and every day Ukrainians were being killed at the front. It was a war the world forgot, which hardly ever reached the news, until the full-scale invasion of February this year. During the 32 years, I've been working closely with the Ukrainian Psychiatric Association and many other organizations in the country to reform mental health care services and to move away from the outdated and inhumane Soviet model of psychiatric care. That model was mainly based on the concept that people with chronic mental health problems or mental disability were redundant and should be housed in large institutions, usually located outside the cities. Community mental health care services did not exist. The whole system was biologically and institutionally oriented, and on top of that, used to rid society of persons who did not fit, to put it bluntly. During numerous assessments we did in the years 2015 until 2019, we found out that about 1/3 of people living in psychoneurological internats, which euphemistically are called social care homes, were not suffering from any mental disorder or disability, but were just dumped there, mainly by relatives because they required special attention, or they owned a flat that could be sold, or were just a burden on their environment. In one of the institutions, we found a 32-year-old girl with no ostensible mental illness who had been outside for the last time when she was 11 years old. And this is just one of many examples. In the course of time, we implemented hundreds of projects, big and small. Some focused on training, others on improving material circumstances, and again others on advocacy and destigmatization. We translated and published 139 psychiatric manuals and other books, and printed them in several print runs to allow professionals to access international psychiatric literature. We organized seminars and conferences, opened doors and windows, and gradually Ukrainian psychiatry became part of world psychiatry. For many who do not know or remember the past, the progress might seem small or not very significant, but one needs to realize where we came from. When I entered the Kiev Psychiatric Hospital for the first time in the summer of 1991, I saw Dante's hell on earth. In the psychogeriatric department, I found 60 to 70 elderly patients in rags, often 3 of them lying on 2 beds shoved together, often without mattresses or bed covers, and with dysfunctional sanitation. The toilets were overflowing and with excrement, and the stench was so hard that it stuck to your nose for a long time after this confrontation. I visited this place together with the chief psychiatrist of Kiev, who had never been there before, and he came out crying as a result of what he saw. A first meeting in 1992 to establish a relative organization, which was supported by the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, ended in a row because some of the relatives opposed the idea of putting all the dirty linen outside. After all, we were agents of world imperialism. An attempt later to establish a treatment center for torture victims in Kiev in 1994 was only successful when the head of the newly established Ukrainian Secret Service, SBU, ordered the local mayor to abandon his opposition against their plans, as this one also thought that we were Western imperialists. And 2 years later, our printing house was raided because we had been denounced by the hospital director, who claimed that we were not printing scientific literature, but rather false US dollars. And these are situations that one can't imagine anymore today, but then those were the daily realities that we had to deal with. So when looking back at these early days, of course, I cannot conclude differently that we've come a long way. Mental health is much less of a stigma than it was 20 or 30 years ago, and in that sense, the war helped a lot, actually. The psychological consequences of the military conflict since 2014 has led to a heightened interest in psychological issues, in mental well-being, and thus also in mental health support and care. In the years 2015, 16, and 17, we and others implemented many specialized programs to develop care programs for traumatized military and civilians, and thankfully, a lot of these services were ready to act when the invasion of February this year caused the first wave of flow of victims. Every crisis is an opportunity, and this is not only politically, resulting in the hope that this war will lead to a truly post-imperial Europe where freedom and parliamentary democracy are the rule, and ideas of the founders of the European Union will be realized. Also in mental health, the war that has now been unleashed on Ukraine can be a game changer if it is properly used. Millions of Ukrainians are now faced with emotional and psychological distress and are seeking some form of moral or psychological support. Mental health is rapidly losing its stigma, and the hope is that when the war is over, new mental health services can be built. And I mean truly new mental health services, not in the sense of new buildings, but in the sense of their nature, community-based and consumer-oriented mental health care services that do not ostracize people from society, but support people to remain in society and have a meaningful, productive, and respectful life. In short, building back better. I would now first like to show you a clip we made especially for this gathering. The clip was produced by filmmaker and friend Lesya Kharchenko, with whom we've been working for many years, and who is now in Kiev with both a husband and a son at the front.
Це на другий день заїжджають уже танком.
300 хворих, невеличкі, 308 було на території лікарні. Уже в перший день війни ввечері всі хворі працівники вимушені були спуститись до підвалу. Практично всю війну не було такого дня, щоб не було обстрілу.
Добрий вечір, дівчата. А що так тихенько, як мишенята тут?
Надька, що ти возишся там? Ти куди? Вот нас знімає камера, а ти куди?
Да, на второй буквально день войны исчезло отопление, потому что были перебиты снарядами коммуникации, сети инженерные.
За час війни в нас померло в закладі 34 пацієнти, з них поховані 15 тут, на даному маленькому кладовищі, яке ми зробили своїми руками. Мені приходилось одягати білий халат і стояти перед нашими працівниками, пацієнтами під снарядами, під прицілом снайперів.
С началом войны изменилось количество поступающих военнослужащих. Они поступают в основном из поля боя. Основные диагнозы – это постконтузийный синдром. Пациенты, которые получили стресс от того, что видели большое количество убитых боевых товарищей.
На территории больницы у нас осталось 2 жилых корпуса, мужское и женское отделение, все остальное администрация и хозгруппа полностью фактически уничтожена. Дорога была тяжелая, больных мы везли около 85 человек, а сопровождало сотрудников только 15. Люди валились с ног, мы ехали вместе с медикаментами.
Моя люба, до мій очерету горить свічка, запалена мною бездомним.
Це дитяче відділення було, воно було закрите. Тобто в багатьох пацієнтів психічний стан погіршився після початку цих обстрілів, так?
Звичайно, до тої хвороби, яка у їх прогресує, додавалося ще і боязнь оцих зривів. Вони і їли, ну вони такі худі зробилися, що я не можу передати.
Мені потрібно вам лікарняний лист закрити. Я вам даю лікарняний лист, де знайшли машину і вас відвезуть.
Before the clip, I mentioned the urgent need for psychological support programs for those affected by the horrors of war. My organization has been in the forefront in developing these services in Ukraine. As I mentioned in the first part of my talk, we founded in 1994 a treatment center for torture victims, the Medical Center for the Treatment of Victims of Totalitarianism and Civil War, which is still functioning today in Kiev. When the war started in 2014, we developed a whole series of training programs in Ukraine, helped establish services, supervised them, and contributed to the founding of a Ukrainian psychotrauma society. In August 2020, the rigged presidential elections in Belarus led to mass arrests with literally tens of thousands of activists winding up in jail, many of them being beaten, tortured, and raped. And many eventually fled the country. In Lithuania alone now, we have 10,000 Belarusian refugees. Many of them need psychological support, and because mental health professionals in the country were also being harassed and arrested, we decided to develop a Russian language safe mental health support program that would function outside the country. A website was developed with 3 components. One part of the information, maintaining your mental health through a healthy lifestyle. Secondly, how to help yourself in time of distress, for instance, depression, anxiety, or panic attacks, or suicidal thoughts. And then thirdly, where to go when you need professional help. When persons register as being from Belarus, they will get access to our specially trained professional consultants who give free online professional help. In 2021, we provided 1,000 of such consultations to almost 100 clients, all of them human rights activists, and 20% of them victims of torture. And this year, we will exceed that number for sure. In addition, we developed news channels on Telegram, on Facebook, and on Instagram, and we've reached an audience of millions. When Ukraine was invaded in February, we immediately developed the same program in Ukrainian and decided to provide mental health consultations to first-line responders, people working in ambulance and rescue services, in hospitals, human rights workers who are documenting evidence of torture and murder, and also mental health professionals. And again, we developed news channels on Telegram, on Instagram, and on Facebook. By now on Facebook, we have over 50 million views. 50 million views. In addition, we opened in Vilnius a crisis center for Ukrainian and Belarusian refugees, of which our small country of 2.5 million inhabitants has now already more than 75,000, most of them women and children who have husbands and fathers in Ukraine, and many of them at the front. And their anxiety and distress is palpable every day. And this is only the beginning of the enormous task ahead of us. Later, we'll have to deal with the longer-term mental health consequences of both civilians and veterans. And considering the enormity of the conflict, I have no doubt that this will result in intergenerational trauma and the urgent need for a well-contained and supported process of healing on an individual, family, and community level. We're preparing, training people like this training, big training on war-related trauma for 150 Ukrainian mental health professionals in Vilnius in September this year, but we will need much more. At the conference I organized last week in Vilnius, the well-known British historian Timothy Garton-Ash referred to the current war as one that can finally lead to a genuinely post-imperial Europe, one where such conflicts are finally truly a matter of the past. I do not know whether he is too optimistic, but I wish to share his belief and hope, and I've decided that my part of the Pardes Humanitarian Award in Mental Health will be committed to furthering that goal and be spent on mental health support in Ukraine to its military and to its population. Thank you.